Good morning, colleagues. The 9,386th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Khaled Khiari, the Assistant Secretary-General for Middle East, Asia and the Pacific in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I give the floor to Mr. Khaled Khiari.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, as we return to this chamber for the third time in 10 days to address the crisis in Ukraine, we continue to witness the widespread destruction and suffering caused by the war. This week, the port city of Odesa has been the target of a devastating wave of airstrikes. On Sunday, a Russian missile attack damaged the UNESCO-protected Transfiguration Cathedral and other historical buildings in the Historic Centre of Odesa, a World Heritage Site. In this shocking attack, one person was reportedly killed and several others, including children, injured. The attack also caused extensive damage to an important place of worship with religious and cultural significance to Ukraine and beyond. Sites like the cathedral are protected under the World Heritage Convention. Attacks against them are a violation of 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. Sunday's attack followed several successive nights of deadly Russian missile and drone strikes targeting Odesa and other cities in southern Ukraine, including Mykolaiv and Chornomorsk, killing at least 3 people and injuring dozens of others. I reiterate the Secretary General's strong condemnation of these attacks. Unfortunately, Sunday's attack was not the first targeting Ukrainian culture and heritage. In fact, since 24 February 2022, UNESCO has verified damage to 274 cultural sites in Ukraine, including 117 religious sites. As the Secretary General stated this weekend, we are concerned about the threat that this war increasingly poses to Ukrainian cultural and heritage, and we urge the Russian Federation to immediately cease attacks against cultural property protected by widely ratified international normative instruments. Madam President, as was underscored by Under-Secretary General Di Carlo and Under-Secretary General Griffiths in this Council last Friday, attacks against Ukrainian Black Sea port facilities risk having far-reaching impacts on global food security, in particular in developing countries. We have now seen disturbing reports of further Russian strikes against port infrastructure, including grain storage facilities in Reni and Izmail ports of the Danube River, a key route for shipment of Ukrainian grain not far from Ukraine's borders with Moldova and Romania. Deliberately targeting infrastructure that facilitates the export of food to the rest of the world could be life-threatening to millions of people who need access to affordable food. These attacks targeting Ukraine's grain export facilities, similarly to all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, are unacceptable and must stop immediately. I must emphasize that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure may constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. The Secretary General stated last week that he would not relent in his efforts to ensure that Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizer are available on international markets, as part of his ongoing efforts to fight global hunger and ensure stable food prices for consumers everywhere. Madam President, the humanitarian response plan for 2023 is 29% funded. We are grateful to donors for ensuring that the humanitarian community in Ukraine can continue to support Ukrainians whose lives have been so brutally disrupted by this war. But further funding is desperately needed to help all of those in need. In the first 6 months of 2023, some 7.3 million people have received humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. The United Nations and its humanitarian partners remain committed to providing life-saving humanitarian assistance and safeguarding the lives and dignity of persons affected by the war. Madam President, in the wake of Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea Initiative, these latest attacks signal a calamitous turn for Ukrainians and the world. Poor cities that allow for the export of grains such as Odesa, Reni and Izmail are a lifeline for many. Now they are the latest casualties in this senseless, brutal war. As long as the war continues, civilians continue to suffer. Ukrainians have suffered enough. The world has suffered enough. I reiterate the Secretary General's call for just and sustainable peace in line with the UN Charter, international law and relevant resolutions of the General Assembly. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Khiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. In a war that has lost its way as part of a policy that has no meaning, a terrible result of an erratic judgment since the start, Russia is targeting everything: innocent people, including children, residential areas, civilian infrastructure, cultural heritage. All these amount to war crimes. With its latest decision to kill the grain deal, Russia is again disrupting the food supply chain. As if this were not enough, it is intentionally targeting ports and grain storage facilities. Russia's intention to target the Ukrainian national identity, its history, architecture, language and culture has never been a secret. It is fully in line with the policy of Kremlin, according to which Ukraine is not a nation and does not have the right to exist. As of 20 July 2023, UNESCO has verified damage to 116 religious sites, 27 museums, 95 buildings of historical and artistic interest, 19 monuments, 12 libraries, and 1 archive. Last week, Russian missiles destroyed the Odesa Transfiguration Cathedral, built in 1794. It was not the first time this cathedral has been under vicious attacks. Kremlin had already done so under Stalin in 1936. 87 years later, illegally acquired Iranian drones used by the Russian army would hit it with the same intention, to destroy it. The cathedral is one of the several historical parts of central Odesa, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I wonder what explanation they will come up with, they who never waste an occasion to pretend that Russia never attacks non-military targets. Colleagues, the intense drone and missile attacks of Russia against Odesa aimed to damage the port infrastructure, including its grain and oil terminal. The bombardment inflicted serious damage to export facilities and destroyed at least 60,000 tons of grain. First, Russia withdraws from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, playing with the anxiety of millions unsure to have food in the coming days and weeks. Now it wants to destroy ports, export facilities, and even silos full of grain. By blocking and bombing Ukrainian seaports and preventing freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, Russia is not only preventing Ukraine to export its grain and agricultural production, it is condemning millions to food insecurity in many parts of the world, mostly in developing countries in the global south, and is again trying to weaponize food. We believe that it's time for this Council to act and work in addressing this issue. Attacks against civilian and critical infrastructure, including infrastructure related to grain exports, must come to an end. We also call on Russia to engage and remove its obstacles to the flow of grain exports through the Black Sea. Colleagues, let's not forget, deliberate attacks against critical infrastructure constitute war crimes. Perpetrators must be held to account. This continued deliberate destruction policy only reinforces the need to continue supporting Ukraine militarily, politically, and economically for its self-defense until proper conditions for peace are created. A peace fully in line with the UN Charter, one that respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, ASG Khiari, for your very sobering briefing. Earlier this morning, Russia wasted this Council's time with another sham meeting, and this one was cruelly ironic, given that Russian forces destroyed Odessa's historic Transfiguration Cathedral just this week with a targeted Russian missile. According to UNESCO, roughly 270 cultural sites have been damaged since President Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The loss of Ukrainian cultural heritage is staggering, and it is truly shameful. And the attack on the historic Transfiguration Cathedral was just one of the many attacks Russia has carried out in the Odessa region this week. The Kremlin's campaign of brutality has been relentless, and the Ukrainian people are paying a heavy price. After Russia's July 19th strike, Odessa city government reported that 1 person died and 8 people were injured. And this past Saturday, Russia's attacks on Odessa killed 1 person and injured 22 others. My heart goes out to the loved ones of those killed and injured, to the communities that have been rocketed by Russian missiles and drones, to the children who have endured so much needless suffering and violence. And of course, we all know Russia's attacks have global consequences. These are attacks on the world's food supply, on all of those facing hunger, malnutrition, and famine, especially in parts of the world that can least afford it. Over the past week, the Russian military has bombarded Odessa and other port cities. One attack destroyed 60,000 tons of grain, which according to the World Food Program is enough to feed more than 270,000 people for a year. And on July 23rd and 24th, Russia struck Ukrainian ports on the Danube, destroying grain storage infrastructure at the port of Reni, just across the river from Romania. Russia's attacks on Chernomorsk, a port that facilitates nearly 70% of Ukrainian wheat exports to developing countries, caused damage that experts say will take at least a year to repair. Colleagues, Russia is hell-bent on preventing Ukrainian grain from reaching global markets, which is why it unilaterally suspended its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Even though Russia never fully implemented the Black Sea Grain Initiative, this arrangement helped get food to those in need. And as the Secretary General has said, it has been a beacon of hope, and we encourage him to continue his efforts to find a path forward to resume the initiative. This initiative, brokered by the United Nations and Turkey, lowered food prices for all. It has been critical to the World Food Programme's humanitarian work in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen. And the Black Sea Grain Initiative disproportionately benefited the developing world. And as Mr. Khiari said, it was a lifeline to many. Russia will tell you otherwise. It will say that only Western countries benefited from this arrangement. But the facts are not on Russia's side, and they know it, which is why they have chosen not to speak in the chamber today. Another temper tantrum for not getting their way. According to the UN, nearly 2/3 of the wheat exported through this arrangement went to developing countries. Global food prices spiked to near record highs after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They rose again after Russia suspended its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And this past Monday, wheat prices spiked in response to Russia's missile barrage against Odesa. The world is paying the price for Russia's barbaric attacks. So let's not both sides this issue. Only one country is weaponizing food. Only one country is cynically using its grain as leverage in order to secure support from other countries. And only one country is responsible for the suspension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We must all urge Russia to cease its attacks on global food security and expand, and fully implement the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And we must continue to hold Russia accountable for its unprovoked illegal war against Ukraine. This Council cannot be silent. It is time to act, and this is a pressing matter of international peace and security. The Ukrainian people need peace. The world needs peace. President Putin, it is far past time for you to silence your guns, withdraw your troops, and end your brutal aggression. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm grateful for the briefing provided by the Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Khiari. Once again, we deplore the fact that following its suspension in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the Russian Federation has decided to accompany this decision by continued attacks on ports, cities, and facilities. We have just held a council meeting convened on the request of Russia on issues involving religion. Today, I wish to reiterate, as we stated to members of this same council in January and May this year, that we are alarmed that the military aggression against Ukraine has led to the destruction of hundreds of religious sites, the majority of which have been verified by UNESCO through its preliminary assessment of the damage caused to cultural sites. In this respect, I wish to recall the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions on the protection of victims from international armed conflicts. Article 53 of that protocol prohibits acts of hostility against places of worship which constitute the cultural spiritual heritage of peoples. We therefore condemn the air strikes on Odesa that led to the destruction of the Orthodox Transfiguration Cathedral, and we recall that none of those acts must be left out of efforts to ensure accountability and reparations. We further condemn the continued attacks on any critical civilian infrastructure and threats to attack civilian vessels. We call for an end to attacks on manufacturing and export infrastructure and on the main or alternative routes for the grain trade. Firstly, because no provision of the United Nations Charter gives the right to one country to invade or attack its neighbour, and secondly, because these actions will continue to worsen global food insecurity. Finally, we call on this Council to insist with the Russian Federation to withdraw its occupying troops and to bring an end to the occupation without further delay.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I thank Mr. Khiari for his briefing. For more than 1 week, the Russian Federation has been raining missiles and drones on the Odesa region. These deadly strikes have one sole objective: to punish Ukraine for its resistance to the Russian aggression, which has allowed Odesa to remain a free city. Since it terminated the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the Russian Federation has been targeting port infrastructure in both Odesa and Mykolaiv. They have been shelling grain silos, grain hangars, and grain terminals at a time when more than 700 million people suffer throughout the world from hunger, Russia has appeared to have already destroyed more than 60,000 tons of grains. Yet again, Russia has been leveraging blackmail as its tactic and hunger as its weapon. Russia has been deliberately blocking exports from Ukrainian ports in order to trigger an increase in agricultural prices in order to inflate profits for its own exports. Russia has been compounding its cynicism with irresponsibility because ultimately the most vulnerable countries are those who suffer as a result of these actions. France will continue to deliver its assistance to people afflicted by this food blackmail through its grain and fertilizer deliveries and through the European Union solidarity corridors. Madam President, by targeting the Historic Centre of Odesa, in January, this historic center was classified as UNESCO Cultural Heritage Site. Russia is seeking to destroy Ukrainian culture and heritage. This registration compels the Russian Federation to protect the exceptional value of the city, value both for Ukraine and for humanity. Striking civilian infrastructure and protected goods is tantamount to perpetrating a double war crime by damaging the Transfiguration Cathedral, the first and most important Orthodox church in Odessa. Russia has revealed its impotence. However, Russia will not manage to break Ukraine by attacking its culture and by destroying its heritage. Quite to the contrary. So Russia needs to end this headlong rush. France will continue to support, alongside UNESCO, the preservation and the reconstruction of this Ukrainian heritage, which is also universal heritage of humanity. For no crime to be left unpunished, France will continue to deliver support for Ukrainian justice and for international criminal justice. Madam President, the Russian aggression against Ukraine has resulted in devastating consequences for the entire world. However, this is also an impasse for Russia because Russia is failing and our support for Ukraine will not waver. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I thank ASG Khiari for his briefing. For some time now, the situation in Ukraine on the ground has been escalating with expanding clashes and confrontations, rising civilian casualties, and ever greater damage to critical civilian infrastructure. There is no end in sight to this war. China finds this deeply concerning. I wish to make 3 points. First, the priority at the moment is to alleviate civilian suffering and prevent the situation from escalation. China calls upon the two parties to the conflict to keep calm and exercise restraint, renounce the logic of military confrontation, and prevent the war from getting out of control beyond the point of no return. Parties to the conflict must strictly comply with international humanitarian law and relevant international conventions, refrain from attacking civilians, civilian infrastructure, cultural heritage sites, or irresponsibly using and transferring cluster munitions. It is especially important not to take any action that might endanger the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. All efforts should be made to prevent nuclear disasters. Second, alleviating the food crisis and containing any spillover effect is an imperative that concerns us all. The Black Sea Grain Initiative and the MOU on facilitating exports of Russian food products and fertilizers are important in terms of stabilizing the global food prices, maintaining global food security, and in particular improving the food supply to the most vulnerable countries. At the moment, the window of opportunity to revive the package deal still exists. The international community should act with a heightened sense of urgency and encourage the parties concerned to speed up dialogue and consultation, to actively meet each other halfway and address each other's concerns so as to resume food and fertilizer exports from both countries. China supports the Secretary General in continuing to make efforts towards this end. Third, The fundamental solution is to promote peace talks for a political settlement. However difficult the situation might be, the door to diplomatic negotiation must never close. Efforts for the cessation of hostilities must not stop. It is imperative to encourage and help the parties to step up engagement and search for solutions that accommodate each other's concerns consistent with regional realities. The international community should support relevant diplomatic endeavors, create a positive atmosphere for peace talks, find a common ground between the parties, and accumulate conditions for the political settlement of the Ukraine issue. Madam President, on the issue of Ukraine, China consistently advocates that all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity should be protected, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter respected, all parties' legitimate security concerns taken on board, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of crises supported. We stand ready to continue to work alongside the rest of the international community towards a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la...
Thank you, Madam President. I too would like to express my thanks to Assistant Secretary General Mr. Khiari for his briefing. Since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, civilian infrastructure has regularly been the target of attacks, causing considerable and sometimes irreversible damage, as well as numerous loss of life and countless wounded among the civilian population. The events over the last few weeks confirm this trend and demonstrate an intensifying violence against civilians. The strategies used by the parties to the conflict, targeting residential areas in order to destabilize their adversary, represent action counter to international peace and security, which deserves to be roundly condemned. The course being followed by this conflict is heightening our concerns. Despite the calls for de-escalation, violence persists and the attacks and reprisals continue unabated. We call on the parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, not to target essential infrastructure and civilian population. The toll is already too high. This is a fact that must bring the belligerents to invest in a diplomatic and political solution. As the food situation is in danger of being deprived of a third of global grain, strikes on the port of Odesa are likely to damage existing infrastructure, which is used to transport grain, raising fears of a real food crisis in several countries of the world. With this in mind, Gabon reiterates its call on the Secretary-General to continue to use his good offices to promote the launch of talks between the parties. The Security Council must, for its part, support and coordinate the different diplomatic initiatives to promote a negotiated settlement. Even if the prospects for peace might seem remote and the sound of cannon fire persists, we hope that dialogue and the melody of peace will eventually triumph. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, dear colleagues, I thank Assistant Secretary General Khaled Khiari for his briefing. Brazil deeply regrets the attacks of the last few days on populated areas in Ukraine, namely in Odessa, resulting in loss of yet more human life and significant damage to civilian infrastructure and to cultural and historic Ukrainian heritage, such as the Transfiguration Cathedral. We note with concern the destruction inflicted to port facilities and transportation infrastructure. We once again call on all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict and its two protocols, the 1972 Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage, and Resolution 2347, adopted by this Council in March 2017. Since the start of the conflict, UNESCO has recorded damage to 270 cultural sites in Ukraine, including 116 places of worship. Brazil welcomes the expected deployment of a mission of the organization to Odessa in the next few days to ascertain the extent of the destruction resulting from the recent attacks. Madam President, once again we stress the urgent need for a peaceful solution to this conflict, fully respecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity as well as the security concerns of the parties involved. The continuation of hostilities will result in more fatalities, in particular of the innocent and more vulnerable, and jeopardizes the future of generations given the extent of the destruction of civilian infrastructure and of the historical and cultural heritage of Ukraine. Reconstruction will also require considerable human and material resources and will take years. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. Mozambique thanks Assistant Secretary General Khaled Khiari for his important insight. It is our considered view that attacks on bridges, on critical port facilities, and grain export infrastructure in the Black Sea signal a significant escalation of the war. These attacks could lead to a full-fledged commerce war and the unintended expansion of the conflict into international waters. We fear that neutral third nation ships passing through these crucial naval routes might be targeted, increasing the risk of collateral damage and retaliatory actions. Madam President, Mozambique urges all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international law, including the requirement to abide by the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, and protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. In this connection, we strongly urge maximum restraint and remind all parties of their obligation under international law. Madam President, as the conflict intensifies and expands, the humanitarian consequences worsen. A refugee crisis looms over the region. In addition, the chances of reviving the Black Sea grain initiative diminish, thus worsening global food shortage and the closing of diplomatic options to de-escalate the conflict. As we have stated in previous Council sessions, Mozambique reiterates its call for an immediate halt of hostilities and the resumption of direct negotiations between the parties. We also emphasize the importance of considering various peace initiatives, including those recently proposed by some African countries in resolving the conflict. We consider this matter to be of utmost urgency, and it must be addressed in complete accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, President. I wish to thank ASG Khiari for his briefing. Today alone, the Council has convened 2 meetings on the situation in Ukraine. This regrettably demonstrates the divergent interest in the ongoing conflict and the evolving complications that arises with the continuation of the war. We once again call on the Council and the wider international community to put aside all differences and make every effort to help the parties to stop this unjustified war. The recent escalation in violence by the Russian Federation against the port city of Odesa has raised concerns over the safety of the civilian population. We know that targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is morally unacceptable and constitutes a violation of international humanitarian law and human rights laws. We therefore join UNESCO in condemning the increased attacks against several cultural sites, including the Historic Centre of Odesa, a World Heritage Property. We recall Security Council Resolution 2347, which condemns any unlawful destruction of cultural heritage during armed conflict, and note that such actions may constitute war crimes. We further recall the obligation of states to respect the 1954 Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property during armed conflict and the 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Convention. We emphasize the need for the parties to heed the calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, and believe that the further militarization of the conflict, fueled by the manifest combative choices of the parties, would not change the dynamics of the conflict on the ground. In our view, it is futile to use force in contemporary state relations. While noting the breaches of international law and the United Nations Charter, we are also disturbed about the negative impact of the conflict on the global humanitarian situation. The war's impact on global food prices is aggravating the socioeconomic conditions of many countries that were already reeling from the adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. We therefore reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease its attacks against cultural property protected by widely ratified international normative instruments, and once again call for the cessation of hostilities by both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Dialogue is the path we must choose, and dialogue is the choice we must support. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Khiari for his briefing. After Russia's termination of the Black Sea Grain Initiative last week, its aggression against Ukraine continues and has intensified in some cases. Russia has used heavy weaponry to target civilian infrastructure, including grain stores in Odesa. It has also launched drone attacks on grain storage facilities in Reni, which is located around 200 meters from Romania across the Danube. Moreover, Russia has unjustly marked all vessels bound for Ukrainian port as potential conveyors of military cargo, which means that Ukrainian grain facilities and civilian shipping across the Black Sea may also be targeted. It is reported that Russia has placed more sea mines near Ukrainian ports. Russia's reprehensible actions clearly demonstrate their strategy of using global food supplies as a weapon, relentlessly causing severe consequences upon those vulnerable across the world. After Russia's termination of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, it has been reported that the grain prices have rapidly hiked. The Council must do everything we can to alleviate the situation at the earliest. Japan once again condemns Russia's action and taking the rest of the world hostage while blaming others for the crisis it has created by its aggression. We also recall that the destruction of civilian infrastructure may constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. Madam President, the aggression's grievous impact on civilians is compounded by Russia's recent missile strike on Odesa that resulted in civilian casualties and damaged a number of significant cultural sites, including the Transfiguration Cathedral, which are protected under the World Heritage Convention. According to UNESCO, as many as 270 cultural sites in Ukraine have been damaged since Russia's onset of hostilities, including religious sites, museums, historically significant buildings, monuments, libraries, and more. Cultural heritage embodies not only a nation's unique identity and history, but also that of humanity at large. Hence, assaults on and damage to cultural heritage equate to assaults on the distinctive identities of the people. Japan reasserts that any harm to cultural heritage is utterly unacceptable and strongly urges all parties involved to honor all pertinent international instruments, including Security Council Resolution 2347 and the UNESCO 1954 Hague Convention, along with its two protocols. Madam President, we extend our gratitude to UNESCO for its unwavering support to the Ukrainian authorities in safeguarding Ukraine's cultural heritage. Japan has contributed over $4.5 million to UNESCO to assist their activities in Ukraine, such as enabling satellite monitoring of priority sites and the repair of damaged locals. Our commitment to support Ukraine is protecting and preserving its cultural heritage and properties remains steadfast. Let us be unequivocal. The global and Ukrainian suffering is a result of Russia's unprovoked aggression. Russia must stop it and withdraw its troops and military equipment from the entire internationally recognized territory of Ukraine immediately, completely, and unconditionally. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, I thank Assistant Secretary General Khiari for his briefing. The destruction and damage to Odesa is a further reminder of the material and intangible costs of the war on civilians, civilian objects, and cultural heritage. Since February 2022, there have been nearly 25,000 civilian casualties recorded in Ukraine, including more than 9,000 killed and close to 16,000 injured. Despite the exhortations of the international community, the destruction of critical civilian infrastructure in Ukraine continues, with estimates of damage in the billions of US dollars. And as mentioned earlier, UNESCO has verified damage to 270 cultural sites in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. The toll wrought by war is heavy, and the road to reconstruction and healing will be long and arduous. As long as this war continues, the level of destruction will only increase. The human price is already too high, but it will be even higher tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. This reality in the ongoing war is causing untold suffering to civilians and leaving behind wounds that will not easily heal. As we noted earlier today, cultural heritage, particularly in places of cultural exchange, represents a prism through which we can view our common humanity. Its damage and destruction are a loss to all of us. We once again reiterate our call on the parties to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law to ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Civilian objects must never be a target of attack. We reiterate today that we must exert all efforts to bring this war to a just, lasting peace that is in line with the UN Charter and respects Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank the Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Khiari, for his briefing. Since the decision of Russia last week to not extend the Black Sea Initiative, the Odesa population has been enduring nights that nobody should have to experience. Switzerland is appalled by the significant increase in Russian attacks targeting the coast of the Black Sea, which have resulted in civilian casualties, the destruction of homes, of port infrastructure, and of grain silos. On Sunday, a number of cultural sites were damaged in the center of Odesa, an area that is protected under the World Heritage Convention as a result of another Russian strike, including, as we heard, the Orthodox Transfiguration Cathedral. Switzerland condemns this latest spate of attacks as part of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. I wish to share 3 observations in this regard. First, over the past 10 days, we have been witnessing an increase in these attacks targeting directly both civilians and civilian infrastructure. We wish to recall that these indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks are prohibited under international law. They must, as an imperative, end. This also applies to humanitarian infrastructure, including personnel and medical supplies, which also benefit special protection, should benefit from special protection. In this context, Switzerland deplores the damage caused recently as part of the Russian artillery strike, targeting a cultural center which served as a humanitarian infrastructure facility in Chasivlar in Donetsk region. Second, attacks affecting areas protected under the World Heritage Convention represent a grave attack to Ukrainian cultural heritage. UNESCO has registered 270 cultural sites damaged since February 2022. Switzerland shares the fears of the Secretary General and UNESCO, according to which the Russian military aggression represents a growing threat for Ukrainian culture. Not just walls are collapsing, cultural heritage is being jeopardized. We call for strict respect for the obligations under international law concerning the protection of cultural property, including the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property during armed conflict. Further, we recall that the intentional destruction of cultural property can constitute a war crime as stipulated under the Rome Statute and as reiterated by the Security Council in Resolution 2347. Third, the decision of Russia to terminate the Black Sea Initiative and its attacks targeting Ukrainian port cities have an impact beyond Ukraine. We iterate our profound concern in light of the potentially devastating consequences for world food security. We urge Russia to reverse this decision. Attacks targeting port infrastructure, including along the Danube, along the Romanian border, as well as threats targeting civilian and civil navigation, represent potential for escalation. We urge restraint and we extend our support for the efforts of the Secretary General and other stakeholders, including the Turkey government, to facilitate free access to global food and fertilizer markets. As strikes continue targeting southern Ukraine, the people has committed to rebuilding the city, its country, its future. We cherish the hope that these efforts will help the city of Odesa to be reborn from the ashes, as was the case with the Transfiguration Cathedral in the past. Switzerland reaffirms its solidarity and support for Ukraine in pursuit of its reconstruction. Thank you.
Statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President, and I also thank ASG Khiari for his remarks. Only last week, the Russian Federation decided to withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This decision was taken in full knowledge of the fact that it seriously risks undoing everything that has been achieved in the last year. It was taken intentionally, knowing that it could exacerbate an already exceptionally difficult food security situation. Since then, the Russian Federation has been repeatedly attacking Ukraine's port of Odesa, a key hub for exporting grain, and deliberately targeting port infrastructure and food storage facilities. The collateral repercussions of these attacks have global ramifications and stand to adversely affect millions, particularly those in developing countries. As a Council, we must monitor the situation closely and consider exploring new options if needed to make sure that the food supply continues to flow as smoothly as possible, despite this decision. Administrative, cultural, religious, and residential buildings have also been subject to a barrage of strikes, resulting in a number of civilian deaths. Russia's destruction of religious sites and places of worship in Ukraine is appalling. Ukraine's Institute for Religious Freedom and UNESCO have catalogued hundreds of religious sites that have been destroyed, damaged, or looted because of Russia's invasion. To these figures, we must also add Sunday's attack against Odesa's Transfiguration Cathedral, situated in the heart of Odesa's UNESCO World Heritage-listed Historic Centre. Such actions may constitute war crimes. They are also a direct attack against Ukraine's identity and further compound the immense suffering of the Ukrainian population. They illustrate, once again, Russia's complete disregard for the UN Charter, international law, and human life itself. We remain firm in our position that perpetrators must be held accountable for their actions. In this connection, last week, we welcomed the establishment of the International Centre for the Prosecution of Crime Against Aggression against Ukraine and the establishment of the Register of Damage Caused by the Aggression of the Russian Federation. These are two important steps towards achieving accountability and ensuring the right to repatriations for the citizens of Ukraine, the legal entities of Ukraine, and the state of Ukraine. Let us remember all the damage and devastation that Russia's war of aggression has caused in Ukraine. The deplorable and unacceptable attacks we have focused on today are yet another worrying development in a long sequence of grave and disturbing events directly resulting from Russia's senseless, unjustified, and unprovoked war. We must never forget that these attacks against civilians and objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Equally, we strongly urge Russia to facilitate the tracing of Ukrainian children and ensure family reunifications. Finally, Madam President, we also stress that the liberation of Ukraine and the full restoration of its sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders is the only way in which we can achieve a just and lasting peace. In achieving this, we will also be restoring the respect for the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by joining others in thanking ASG Khiari for your informative briefing. Since it terminated the Black Sea Grain Initiative last week, Russia has unleashed a new barrage of strikes on Ukraine's towns and cities. On Sunday, Russia attacked Odessa's UNESCO-listed city centre, injuring dozens, including 4 children. Among the buildings badly damaged, as we've heard, was the Transfiguration Cathedral, Odessa's largest Orthodox church. The Transfiguration Cathedral has been bombed twice, in 1936 on Stalin's orders, and now by Putin's order. This act of cultural and religious vandalism struck at the heart of the civilian community and was condemned by the Director General of UNESCO. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has left a wide trail of destruction across the country. UNESCO has verified damage to over 270 cultural or historical sites, including libraries, churches, theatres, museums and memorials. Thousands of artworks and other artefacts have been stolen. Russia is imposing its laws and education systems in Ukraine, restricting Ukrainian media and indigenous languages, and trying to indoctrinate Ukrainian children through forced transfers to Russia. Russia is seeking to destroy Ukraine's history, identity, and cultural heritage. With these strikes, Russia is also harming the world's hungriest. By targeting Ukraine's Black Sea and Danube ports, Russia is trying to damage Ukraine's ability to export food. It's already destroyed tens of thousands of tons of food and reduced Ukraine's ability to store its upcoming harvest, pushing up global food prices. We stand with the people of Ukraine as they rebuild after Russia's attacks, and we fully support the UN's continued efforts to bring food onto global markets. Russia is not even trying to hide the cynicism and cruelty of its illegal war. It is trying to bring Ukraine to its knees and to wear down the international community. But Ukraine will not be subjugated, and we will not relent in our support for Ukraine, including in this Council. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Assistant Secretary General Khiari. I also recognize the silent residual presence of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. I would like to thank the UK Presidency for organizing this meeting of the Security Council at the request of the delegation of Ukraine. Last Friday, we informed the Security Council of the deliberate Russian attacks in the Odesa region immediately after Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Since that time, Russia has escalated its missile terror against Odessa. On July 23, Russia carried out its 5th airstrike in a row, shelling the city center of Odessa with 19 missiles of different types, including anti-ship missiles. We reiterate that using anti-ship missiles against ground targets effectively turns them into low-precision weapons of indiscriminate effect. As a result, the Historic Centre of Odesa, a designated World Heritage Site, sustained heavy damage. The barrage of Russian missiles hit 29 historical and cultural landmarks, including museums and religious and residential buildings. As follows from the statement made by UNESCO, and I quote, "Taking place just 2 weeks after the strike that destroyed a historic building in Lviv, this attack is the second to date in an area protected under the World Heritage Convention in violation of the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. This strike also coincided with the destruction of the Culture Center of Folk Art and Art Education in the city of Mykolaiv, 100 kilometers away." End of quote. A preliminary assessment in Odesa has revealed damage to several museums inside the buffer zone of the World Heritage Property, including the Odesa Archaeological Museum, the Odesa Maritime Museum, and the Odesa Literature Museum. They had all been marked by UNESCO and local authorities with the blue shield, the distinctive emblem of the 1954 Hague Convention. In total, nearly 50 buildings were damaged or destroyed following the attack, including 4 schools, 5 kindergartens, and 2 extracurricular educational institutions. The building of the Greek consulate was also damaged, and this is already the second consular office in Odesa to be hit by Russian terror. Just last week, following another such attack, the Chinese consulate was damaged. What is most terrible is that each Russian attack increases the number of fatalities among the civilian population. The last strike on Odesa on the night of the 23rd July left 1 civilian killed and 22 people wounded. We appreciate the clear message from the UN Secretary General, who strongly condemned the Russian Federation missile attack on Odesa. The Secretary General concerns about the increasing threat to Ukrainian culture and heritage are completely justified, as both are considered by the Russian aggressor to be primary targets in their attempts to eliminate the Ukrainian identity. Ukrainian grain and other foodstuffs remain another target that Russia is trying to eliminate, not caring at all about the severe implications for global food security. To this end, the aggressor continues its attacks against port infrastructure and grain storage facilities in Ukraine's south. On July 24, Russia launched Iranian origin drones to attack Reni, a port city on the Danube River in the Odesa region. 3 storage facilities full of grain were destroyed. These aggressive actions merit a strong response. Otherwise, Russia will be encouraged to further undermine the security situation in the Black Sea by attacking civilian vessels and laying additional mines in the waters adjacent to the Ukrainian coastline. There are grounds to believe that Russia is preparing such incidents for the purposes of blaming Ukraine and discouraging vessels from other countries from entering Ukrainian waters and using Ukrainian ports. We reiterate that the Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports, destruction of their infrastructure, obstruction of grain exports, as well as intimidation of foreign merchant vessels should be considered as an attack on the freedom of navigation. These actions also aim at eliminating a market competitor deliberately raising world food prices and making a profit at the expense of the millions of people around the world who will suffer. Madam President, Odesa is not the only place where the Russian army increases the scale of destruction and casualties, in particular among children. On July 24, Russia deliberately shelled with multiple rocket launchers the city of Konstantinivka, Donetsk region. 3 people, including 2 children, were killed. 6 others, including 4 children, were wounded. Russian forces insidiously and cruelly attacked the city in the evening, targeting a local pond where families with kids were resting. The Ukrainian children who have been trapped in the occupied territories of Ukraine are now subject to anti-Ukrainian indoctrination and propaganda aimed at instilling hatred towards Ukraine, its language, culture, and history. To this end, the Russian occupation administration sent children to the occupied Crimea, the Russian Federation, and Belarus for so-called, quote-unquote, vacation and recreation. There is a significant increase in the number of organized trips of groups of children not only to the territorially closer Crimea and the Krasnodar region, but also to Russia's far east. It is planned to take at least 30,000 children away from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. The main goal of such recreation for the Ukrainian children, as claimed, is to ensure, I quote, the socio-cultural integration of children into Russian society, end of quote, which effectively means aggressive brainwashing. According to available information, since the beginning of the invasion, more than 3,000 Ukrainian children have been transported to Belarus from the temporarily occupied Donetsk and Lugansk regions under the guise of so-called health rehabilitation. Madam President, yesterday the State Duma of the Russian Federation adopted the law on increasing the age of conscription. While introducing the draft, Chair of Duma Defense Committee, Kartapolov, former high-rank general of the Russian army, openly said, and I quote, "This law has been written for a big war, for general mobilization, and now this big war is already being felt," end of quote. Instead of seeking peace, they continue to dream of a big war where Ukraine would not be the sole target. Threats from Putin's ally, Lukashenko, about the intents of the Wagner Group, I quote, to go west to Warsaw, to Rzeszów, end of quote, serve as another example of their unwillingness to proceed towards de-escalation. Allow me to also reiterate that, unlike Russia that seeks only greater war, Ukraine has proposed the peace formula, the fundamental principles of which align with the resolution principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, supported by 141 votes in the United Nations General Assembly. It includes, among others, food security, which the Russian Federation is so desperately trying to undermine by devastating armed attacks and sea blockades aimed against my country. The peace formula introduced by President Volodymyr Zelensky in November 2022 stands today as the only pointer towards restoring a just and lasting peace and stability in the region, as well as the world order based on the rule of law. We appeal to the Member States to join the initiative and to take part in the implementation of the specific points of the formula. The only way to avoid further deterioration and expansion of the scope of war is to keep the solidarity and unity of purpose towards the need to restore respect to the principles of the UN Charter, to ensure the military defeat of Russia in Ukraine and accountability for the crime of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, as well as to deprive Russia of the capabilities to wage wars and to inflict harm on its neighbors and people around the world. And to conclude, I join the demands of those previous speakers who demanded this Council must, I repeat, must act. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.